I think I'm here. Hi,
Okay.
Matt. How are you doing?
Doing good. How about yourself?
I'm great. Thank you so much. Thank you. I just want to say welcome to everybody. For those I don't know, my name is Wendy Woodland, and I'm a volunteer and board member with Montgomery Preservation. And if you happen to not be familiar with our group, we're the county's historic preservation nonprofit. We're made up of individuals and organization partners who help to preserve, protect, and promote our architectural heritage and historic landscapes. We own and we sponsor programs at the historic Silver Spring, downtown Silver Spring B&O train station that's located at 8100 Georgia Avenue. I just want to say I'm so grateful we're able to bring you this workshop, which was originally postponed because of this great pandemic pause, via this virtual platform.
Wendy, are you still there? I think we lost your audio. All right, folks, bear with us just a moment while we get this figured out here. Wendy?
Thank you. I'm
there
still
you
here.
Okay.
Oh, great. I just want to say again that I'm grateful we're able to bring you this workshop. It was originally postponed because of the pandemic pause, to our open house scheduling, but I'm glad we're able to bring it to you on this virtual platform. So I'm going to go ahead with the business of the day. I want to introduce you to today's speaker, who's brought to us from the Montgomery County Speakers Bureau. Lorraine Miner has been researching her family history for over 25 years. She is the past president of the Genealogical Society of the Montgomery County Historical Society and has served as chair of the Education Committee and is currently co-program chair. She completed the National Genealogical Society Home Study course and several family history courses from Brigham Young University and attended the National Institute on Genealogical Research. She teaches classes and speaks locally on basic genealogical subjects. Today, her talk will focus on beginning your census research. It's going to be an introduction to how to use U.S. Census records and the indexing system. So, Lorraine, are you there?
I am.
Oh, welcome. Okay, we'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. And let me see. Yeah. I need to be able to.
Yeah, give me just a second. I forgot to press that.
Flip over. We'll press.
Yep.
There you go.
Okay, let's see. Now you should be able to, Lorraine.
Yep. Here we go. Now I just need to figure out which one it is. Oh.
There we go.
There we go. Okay, well, thank you all for coming. I always talk about the census as being the United States government's gift to genealogists, and I'm hoping by the time we finish, you'll understand why it is so useful and so important for our genealogical research. The census is mandated in the Constitution, and as you probably realize, and hopefully have already submitted your census returns, this is a census year, and it's required initially for determining the representation in the House of Representatives. And of course, today it's used for much more, but that's why it was set up. We have had a census every year since 1790. And between 1790 and 1840, the census was just a count of the population with not every name listed. Starting in 1850 and later, every name was listed in the census with, unfortunately, the exception of slaves. And there were a number of different questions asked. The purpose being to gather statistics about the population, but those questions are some of the things that make the census so valuable to genealogical researchers. The census is supposed to reflect what the household looked like on a given day. So even if the census taker arrived 2 months after the census date, he was supposed to ask the family who was living in the household on that date. So if somebody was born after the census date, then they shouldn't be listed on the census. And if they died or moved after the date, they should be. Of course, we're not really sure what the census taker told the people he was talking to, so it's not clear for sure what we're really seeing, but it's something to keep in mind. The census date changed over the years, and I've given, if you have a copy of those handouts, my handout, you'll see the dates are listed there. For the most part, the censuses are available for researchers. There are a few exceptions, and I've listed them on this slide. The 1790 schedules and a few of the 1800 schedules were burned during the War of 1812. But people have tried to use other sources like tax lists to create a list of people who were alive for those years. The 1890 census was destroyed as a result of a fire in the Commerce Department. There are a few pieces available, and I'll tell you what they are later on. And just be aware that some of the 19th century schedules that you actually see online are not what the not what the census taker wrote originally. Once they had done the census, they would go home and they would make copies. And so what you often see from the 1800s, are those copies. And of course, we know what happens when people make copies. Sometimes things get a little messed up. In 1870, it was right after the Civil War, it is estimated that about 10% of the population in the South was not counted. And the census was so undercounted in the big cities that they actually did a second count. And if you can tell that if you look at the census on Ancestry and Heritage Quest, but you're not going to see that at some of the other online census places like Family Search. So why do you want to do census research? Well, the biggest thing is it puts an individual in a certain place at a given time. You really don't know where you're going to be doing research unless you can pinpoint their presence at a place and a time. And it also helps to trace migration across the country. You'll see that somebody is in Illinois, but one of their children was born, the oldest child was born in Virginia, and the next couple of children were born in Kentucky. And so you can see how the family moved across the country. And that gives you clues to where you might want to do research. From 1850 on, it gives you the family unit. So you not only have the father, usually the head of household, but you'll see the names of all the children. Sometimes you'll see siblings listed, and sometimes you'll actually see more than one generation in the household. which often means that if you see a mother-in-law, that might give you the maiden name of the wife, which is always hard to find. You can also find out about neighbors. Neighbors are very important when you're doing research. And this is true whether you're in your ancestor lived in the country or he lived in a city, because we moved with our neighbors, we married our neighbors, and often neighbors were related. And so even though they might have a different surname, as you start doing the research, you realize, oh, well, that's the brother-in-law or whatever. So it's really important to pay attention to neighbors. One thing to keep in mind is that when you look at a census and it says the person is a lodger or a boarder, it actually may be a relative. And here's an example of that. You can see, hold on a sec. You can see at line 336, we have William Craig. It's hard to read his surname. But if you drop down 2 lines, you'll see Maud Moore, and she's listed as a boarder. I believe she is his niece. I don't have any more proof than the fact that the name is right, the birth date is right, but, and I was surprised to see her listed as a boarder until I read just recently, actually, that was often the case. So keep that in mind when you're looking at census entries. Now, here's something else that you also want to keep in mind, because I just said it's important for you to look at the neighbors, because they might be family, or you might migrate with them or whatever. But before 1880, the census takers were told they should make an inquiry at every dwelling house, or by personally talking to the head of every family. So that did not mean that the census taker actually went from house to house. He could have been, let's say, the postmaster. And when somebody came in, he got the information. So he didn't have to go out to those houses. We don't know. From 1880 forward, he did have to visit every house. And so then you are sure that the people that are enumerated on either side of the family are really neighbors. And this was pointed out because somebody looked at a plat map from Ashland County, Ohio, 1860. And then he looked at the census, and he could see that sometimes the households that were enumerated next to each other lived several miles from each other. So it's just another thing to keep in mind when you're looking at the censuses. We also learned some other information from the census that is going to be useful in tracking our ancestors. Things like place of birth, if they immigrated, when they immigrated, and also whether or not they owned property. So the census is organized by state, and then county, and then maybe a smaller political subdivision. And then they, in 1880 and later, they added something called an enumeration district, which is the way the Census Bureau coordinated areas into smaller subdivisions. So when you record the information that you find in the census, it's important that you cite where you found it. And so this are the kinds of things that you want to include so that it will be easy for you or someone else to look at that census image again. If you were at the Silver Spring, when I gave the talk on getting started in genealogy, you'll remember that I really emphasized the importance of citing your sources. It helps you find where you found information, it helps you get back to it, and it also leads credence to what you are saying about the information about your family. So I'm going to go through and just give you a brief example of what some of the census schedules look like. So this is the 1820 census, and you can see that it doesn't really cover, I mean, it's pretty minimal. Basically, what they have done is divided males and females into age categories. And what you see is the name of the head of household, and then how many people, males or females, how many males or females are in each one of those categories. And then at the end, they have a category for free people of color, and then another category for slaves. So this one is Montgomery County in 1820, and you'll see that a number of people actually did own quite a few slaves. So that's 1820. By 1840, they were already starting to be a little bit more specific in what they wanted to learn. They still had the name of the head of household, they still had the categories, but you can see they've expanded it so that now there are free white persons, male and female, free colored persons, male and female, and then well, I just want to mention, I've highlighted where the actual information about where the census was taken. It's along the side. In this particular case, it's in Williams County, Ohio. And I get the Ohio from the second page. Now, on the second page is where you would see information about the number of slaves. And then they're starting to ask questions. How many people are involved in different categories like agriculture, commerce, and then other questions about how many people are attending, what kind of schools you have, and other issues. So some of this particular example, it's pretty just vanilla. You have people and most everybody is in agriculture. If you look at the top line and over far to the right, you'll see that there is a mark in that column, the far right column, and that's for whether they were able to read and write. So again, this will enable you to learn a little bit about your ancestor as to their level of literacy. And this would be how you'd cite the 1840 census. And you see I include the name of the county, the state, and then the township, the page, the person, and then where I got it. And I'm gonna kind of show other citations, but I'm not gonna really dwell on it. But you can see that you wanna give as much information as you can so that somebody else can find that entry. Now here's the 1850 census, and now we have the name of the location at the top of the page, And now they've added something called the dwelling and the family. So this was the way of determining actually how many buildings where people lived were in the area. And then with the family, if you had more than one family living in a house, and this is often common in the cities, then you're going to see a different number. So in this case, well, actually, even in this case, we're at 658 dwelling, but the family is 660. And you can see now we're getting the name of each person and their age, where they were, their occupation and where they were born. And then some other information, whether they attended school in the last year or so. So a little bit more information. Certainly the place of birth is very beneficial, so that it's helping you put more information about the family. And the other thing is whether or not the value of the real estate they owned. So you will know then whether or not your ancestor actually owned property or was renting or whatever. Now, one thing I want to caution you, when you look at these families and you see a male and a female, and then a bunch of children, it's very comforting to say, oh, that's the man, husband and the wife, and those are all the children. You don't know that for sure. Probably in 95% of the cases, that's true. But there's always the chance that they aren't man and wife. They may be brother and sister, and or they could be the husband. That could be all of his children. His wife died and he remarried. You don't know for sure, but keep that in mind. Oh, and then the 1850 census, the page, every other page is numbered, and that's because there was a front and a back. It was just like a book, and the leaf was repeated on each page. And here is the citation. You notice now we've included the dwelling and the family in the citation. This is the 1850 slave schedule. So you see that this actually is in Maryland. And the thing I want to caution or show you about the slave schedules that appeared in 1850 and 1860 is there is no name associated with the slaves. It's only their sex, their age, and whether their color, whether they're black or mulatto. And the names that you see could be the name of the slave owner, or it could be the name of the overseer. Again, you don't know. It would require more research. Something to be aware of is that when you do a search at Ancestry for a person, you let's say you think your ancestor may have owned slaves, and so you search for him and you don't get a hit in the slave schedules. So you think, oh, they must not have owned slaves. Well, that's not the way Ancestry does it. At Ancestry, you must search the slave schedule separately to see whether a person is listed as the owner or the overseer. At Family Search, when you do a search, then you will find both an entry in the regular census and in the slave schedule. So here again is the citation, and you notice it says Joshua Johnson, owner or manager, because we don't know just from looking at the schedule which is true. Now here's the 1880 census. That's another breakthrough in the census, and that's the first year where you can actually see the relationship of everybody in the household to the head of household. And you also see not only where the individual was born, but where the parents were born. And so you can quickly determine maybe that not all of the children listed are belong to both the husband and wife. If the husband was born in Maryland, the wife was born in Virginia, and then when you look at the children, they say something different for where the parents were born. So that kind of gives you a clue that not all these children belong to both parents. Okay, now the 1900 census. See, each census year there's a little bit different, a little bit more useful information. In the 1900 census, you can see that, again, they're asking information about where the people were born and where their parents were born. But there's also a question about the number of years the people have been married, and also a question about how many children have been born to the wife and how many are still living. And that is very interesting information, because you will find that often you don't know about those children that died either very young or when they were younger. So that happened to me with my grandmother. I did not know she had a sister that was born in the United States and died at 1 year old. And I had my first clue when I looked at that family in the census. The other thing about the 1900 census is that it's the only census that asks for the month and year that somebody was born. So if you are lucky enough to have somebody that was enumerated in the census, that's a really valuable clue in doing your research. The most recent census that's available is 1940. It doesn't have, some of the questions they asked are not as valuable. For example, only 2 people are asked where their parents were born. But one thing it does do is ask where they were living in 1935. This is still the Depression. There was a lot of concern in the government as to whether or not families, how much movement, how many people were moving around. And so they asked this question. Again, that's helpful for the kind of information that might be useful when you're doing your research. I should mention that we're getting close to when the 1950 census will be released. It's 75 years. So in 2022, we should get a release of the 1950 census. And it takes, the reason I said 2022 is it takes a while once the deadline is passed for that to get out. So how do you get started with your research? The first thing you want to do is gather everything you already know about your family. So especially birth, death, and marriage. You want to know who people married and the names and ages relatively about other family members, so you can identify that you are actually looking at the right person when you're looking at an entry in the census. Start with the latest available census, which would be 1940, and start working back. One of the things that's a challenge when looking at the censuses is the handwriting. So one of the things you can do is look around the page if you're not sure of what a particular letter is. Here's an example from the census. And we have John, and the next entry is not clear what that first letter is. It could be an S, it could be an L. It's not clear. But if we look at the whole census and then look down, we can see that there is a Lewis who is listed. And if you look back at the top, you can see that, yeah, that's kind of the same way that the name is written. And I've decided that that is for Lena. Now we also have a couple of other names here. You see there's Armadillo, which is an unusual name, but I've seen many unusual names in the census. I've seen first names of Mississippi, that one stuck in my mind. And then the name above Armadillo. It's not really clear what it is, but if you sound it out, Oliva, her name is Olivia. And I think that the census taker wrote what he heard. He probably wasn't that good a speller, and so he did the best. He wasn't familiar with Olivia, so he wrote Olivia. If you think about it, it's linguistically pretty similar. So the census is available all over. It's available for free at Heritage Quest, which is accessible through Montgomery County and I believe PG County with a library card. And then Family Search, which you can use free from home. And then there are a number of subscription sites that also have the census. So what I always suggest people do is start with a broad search, maybe with the name you're looking for, and if you know the state or the county they live, enter that. And then if you're still getting too many hits, you can narrow it down a bit. If you get too few hits, then you have to try other techniques. Maybe a different first name if we're talking about 1850 and later. Maybe the first name of the head of household or the person you're looking for is kind of unusual and the indexer really didn't do a good job of transcribing it. But if you had another more common name, it's more likely to be transcribed correctly. You can try doing surname only or given name only. So try different techniques if you're not finding your person. I want to talk a little bit about how you can use Family Search, which is available online. All you have to do is register with a free account, and then you can access, you create your account, and then you can access all the records that are available. So to get to the census, you click on Search and then Records. And you can then enter a name. I'm going to enter Abe Morris. And it's going to come up and ask me to sign in. Once I've signed in, I'm going to get a list of Abe Morris's, and it's basically all, it's just a list that goes on forever. It says that it has 1 million entries. Well, let's say I'm not interested in the 1940 census. Let's say I'm interested in the 1930 census. How am I going to get to that? Well, if you click on the box that says collections, then all the hits are organized by kinds of databases and then individual databases. So if I look at the census and list topic, you can see that it shows the top 5, and these are the top 5 results in numbers. And if I wasn't seeing what I wanted there, I can click on show all, and then I'd see all the censuses where Abe Morris shows up. Now I'm going to click on 1930, and you can see that I'm still getting a lot, obviously with a name like Abe Morris, I'm getting a lot of various hits. So if I click on residence and enter Maine, then I get the Abe Morris I'm looking for, who is the top entry. And you can either click on the name, or you can click on the, the box under view that looks like a piece of paper, and then you will see the transcription of that census. What I want to emphasize is that you don't just look at the transcribed census. You always look at the original. And you can either see the original by clicking where it says view the original, or back on the previous screen, you can click on the camera, and that will take you to the original census. The reason you want to actually look at the original is that indexers make mistakes. And here is a classic example. You see, this is the entry for James Schroebach, who's a pastor at St. Mary's Church. And you notice that the other people in the household are listed as a wife, age 58. James is 32. Catherine, his sister, who's 19. And then another person named Jean Nicolas, who is his son, age 7. So you look at that, you might wonder about the wife being quite a bit older, but other than that, yeah. But if you look at the actual census, you will see that Margarita is his mother, not his wife. Catherine is his sister, but Nicholas, or Jean Nicholas, is his uncle. And the age that they transcribed is not correct. I think it's probably either 41 or 48. It's hard to tell, but it's definitely not 7. That's why you look at the original. So now here's an example when using Ancestry. And again, now I want to just say that the screen looks a little different now, but you get there the same way. They keep changing their screens, and sometimes I just don't update, but as long as I can show you how to get there, I just use what I already have. So we do a search and we go to census and voter lists. And then on the right, you'll see under census and voter list, US Federal Census Collection. Now, if you wanted to search all the census years, you could do so here, but you could scroll down and you could pick which census year you want to select. And this is the way you get to those slave schedules, where you would not, if you had done the general search, you would not have found an entry for somebody who was listed in the slave schedule. I'm going to do the 1920 census. I'm looking at George Breeding. And it turns out he comes up at the bottom of the screen. I'm going to view the record. And this is where, again, you get that transcription. I can view the original image, or if I scroll down, I get the source citation for that image. When I can also view the original image by clicking on that, I don't know, I guess it's a magnifying glass, I guess, to see what it looks like. Okay, so here's the original image. Now, you can move to the next image by clicking on the arrows, the right arrow, or to go back on the left arrow. The little thing that looks like a bunch of tools, like a hammer and a wrench, that's the toolbox that gives you more options. And if you click on the thing that looks like a film, you can get a film strip at the bottom of the screen. And you can actually select the image that you want by clicking there and entering an image number. Now, I wanted to show you this particular image because this is my husband's great-grandfather, George W. Breeding, and his wife and daughter. And then he has two grandsons living in the family, Horace P. and Cecil H. Well, we know who Cecil H. is. That's my husband's uncle. But we don't know who Horace P. is because the name should be Forrest T. And I think you can hear when I say it, Horace P., Forrest T. The census taker got the wrong name, wrote it down wrong. And that happens more often than you think. I've seen somebody named Sarah enumerated as Sam with the wrong sex. So just be aware that sometimes the census taker only, you didn't quite hear what he was being told. Also, the indexer often is maybe not familiar with the family name, or types something in wrong. One of the entries for my Morris family was entered as Maris. So be aware that those other problems can occur. And so, like I said before, you want to try other spellings. If you happen to know, like when I was trying to find my Morris family, I knew the name of the people who lived next door. So I just searched for them, and sure enough, then I found my grandparents. You can try looking for the wife's name or the children's first name. And sometimes you just go, if they're in a small town, you just start looking through that town page by page. And usually it's not more than 10, 15 pages. Another thing you can do is try another website, because they use different indexers. So maybe the other indexers did a better job. And you can also find the people in a city directory, so you know their address. And then there are ways you can actually go to the address in the census to see if you can find the people. Okay, I want to really mention a little bit about immigrant information that's available in the census, because for people who have ancestors who immigrated, especially in the early 20th century, when the big wave of migration came to this country, there's a lot of information that may be very useful to you. First of all, I just want to mention what the letters mean under the column says naturalization status. If it says AL, it means it stands for alien. It means they have taken no action to become a citizen. If you see PA, it means they've filed their declaration of intent to become a citizen. And it's often called the first papers. And then if you see NA, it means they've been naturalized, sort of. Things get a little complicated in the nationalization area because of what happened, because of the passage of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. Up until that time, a woman who married somebody who was not a citizen lost their citizenship. But it really didn't matter because what the most important thing about being a citizen is that you could vote. Women couldn't vote, so that little distinction was not a big deal. But then after the passage of the 19th Amendment, then it became more complicated. So I've kind of outlined this. It's in the handout. So it's something to be aware of when you're looking at citizenship, especially in the 1930 and 1940 census. So I want to show you what you can find by looking at census entries regarding citizenship. The top one is from 1920, and this is for Abe Morris, who we already looked at a bit. And you see that it says that he was born in Poland. If you look down, you notice that in 1910, he says he was born in Russian. And the same is indicated in 1900. I'm sorry, it's 1930, 1920, and 1910. And there is no difference in this because in 1920, Poland was part of the Russian Empire, and it was only later that it became independent. So if you have ancestors who came from Eastern Europe, you may see differences in the place of birth. It doesn't mean that they were confused. It means that the designation changed. Now, the other thing I've highlighted on the 1930 list is the year that he was naturalized. He says he was naturalized in 1913. And then in the 1920 census, he says that he's not naturalized. So again, you're going to see different pieces of information about the same fact in different censuses. However, if you're lucky, you'll see in this particular case that all of the highlighted years of immigration say 1903. This is, and it is a fact that this family did immigrate in 1903. So now I actually have a clue that seems to have been verified in more than one place that helps me when I'm starting to look for passenger arrival records for this family. I also want to mention something that I forgot to mention in the, actually because I didn't show you the 1910 census. If you look at the bottom little segment, you'll notice Edward Morris. And if you look across, you'll see something that says M2. The census asked if you were married, how many times you had been married. This is the only census year they asked that question. It turns out that Edward had been married twice. I did not know that until I saw that entry. And then I started asking family members, and sure, they knew all about it, but nobody talked about it. So again, these censuses do have some clues that may reveal things that you did not know. So you want to be aware that you don't know who provided this information in the census, with the exception of 1940, when it's actually marked on the census page. You don't know if it was the 8-year-old boy at the farm and he just gave what he knew, maybe good, maybe not. We showed you some examples where it was unclear, or the census taker obviously did not understand what he was being told. And we don't know what the census taker asked, because some of these nuances should have been clear to the census taker, but may have not have been, or he may not have explained it very well when asking the questions. So you're going to see the same questions answered differently. And of course, one of the big things you'll see is differences in ages. Part of that is because a lot of times in the 19th century, especially, people didn't really, were as concerned about age. And they may not have actually known what year they were born. Of course, we don't know who answered it, so maybe the person answering the question didn't know. And of course, then we also have the situation with women who sometimes don't like to age as much as they would every 10 years. So that's often an issue. So to get the most from the census, you want to look at all the years for the family. As I said, starting from the most recent and start going back. Boundaries change. When I say boundaries change, I'm not just talking about foreign countries where, like, the Russian Empire and now became Poland and other countries. I'm talking about counties in the United States. As the United States grew, as the population grew, people petitioned the state to have their courthouse or their county a little bit more compact and the courthouse closer to them. And so counties were made up from older counties. Often, a farmer lived in the same place for his entire adult life, but may have lived in 2 or 3 different counties. So you need to be aware of that. Look at the date that they actually went to and talked to the head of household. So, because that's going to give you an idea of whether there may be some discrepancies in ages, especially. And then look at what you see that's consistent. That's going to give you clues, and that'll help you in your future research. I wanted to show, oh, yes. I had mentioned before that the 1870 census was so bad that they actually redid it in New York. And here's an example. If you look at the top, you see it was actually enumerated in January of 1871. So I am thinking that this was actually a redo of the census in New York. And because of it was so bad in when they did the original one. So that's a little bit closer time. You can see how 1870 is crossed out, and it's really 1871. I mentioned that the 1890 census was burned, but there was something called the special census, which enumerated, it was supposed to enumerate Civil War veterans and their widows. And not all of that was destroyed. And you can see which schedules still exist. If they exist for the place where your ancestor lived, it would give you some really good clues as to what their service was in the Civil War. It was supposed to be for Union veterans, but some of the enumerators also included Confederate veterans. So if you look at one of the southern states, you may find information about your Confederate ancestor also, so it doesn't hurt to look. There are also a number of non-population censuses that were done. They were done with the regular census. There was one, what they called defective, dependent, and delinquent. Sounds awful, but if you had an ancestor who was blind or deaf, you might find them in this schedule. The big one that is very useful is the mortality schedule. It was done 1850 through 1880, and it asked people it was a list of people who had died within the last year. Most of the states did not keep death records, so it's very hard to find out exactly when an ancestor died. If they happen to die in the year before the census in those years, then you're going to get some additional information. Now here's what the schedule looks like for 1880. And if we look closer, you will see that the middle line, we have Miranda Buck, age 55. It says she and her parents were born in North Carolina. She's keeping house. She died in November of pneumonia. And the 26 is the number of years she had lived in the county. So right away, I've got information about when she moved to this county. I knew she moved between 2 census years, but now I can narrow it down even more. So that's why these mortality schedules are so useful. Don't ignore state and territorial censuses. Some of the state censuses were taken in the years like on the 5s. So that gives you another time period to see about what your ancestors were doing. Territorial censuses are very valuable. They were taken every year in the hopes of showing that the population was high enough so that they could be petitioned for statehood. So I hope I've shown you how valuable the census is in tracing your ancestors, putting them in a time and a place and seeing who their neighbors and associates are. I'm hoping that I have shown you why it's so important to look at the original, and that even though this is a great tool, you have to realize that census records are not always reliable, and they're really just giving you clues. So I guess I'm gonna stop sharing my screen, and do we have any questions?
Okay, yeah, again, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function, and we'll get to any of those. At the moment, there aren't any. I don't know if Wendy had any comments she wanted to add. Let me see if I can unmute her microphone. Wendy, are you there?
Ah, there you are. Okay. No, thank you. I always find this fascinating. I'm sitting here writing notes after note after note after note. I just want everybody to be aware that, you know, we'll have a recording of this session on our website, so you can go back and refer to any notes you were taking today. And Lorraine kept referring to a handout. We do have a handout that accompanies this talk, and you'll be able to download it for your future use and reference. But oh gosh, I've just learned so many more things that I knew about, especially with the mortality records and all. I didn't even know they existed, the mortality schedules.
I did have one question that came through. It says, you just answered my question regarding handout. So it's not really a question, but
okay, good.
It was asked and answered at the same time.
Excellent, excellent.
Okay, well, I don't see anything else. As Wendy said, the recording will be posted on the MPI website. And yeah, I guess we're good. Lorraine, did you have any closing thoughts you wanted to add?
No, not that I can think of. I'm just, you know, I'm just a big fan of the census. It's my first place I look when I'm starting out with somebody new. And I hope people have a lot of success in using it.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
We'll see you again in July. Look forward
Okay.
to it. Matt, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Schedule. Okay. Talk to you all soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.